There's a question that most people spend their entire lives either avoiding or answering too quickly. Who am I? Not in the philosophical sense, not the abstract metaphysical inquiry, in the immediate, practical, and daily life sense. Who am I when no one is watching? When there's nothing to perform and no one to perform it for? When the roles have been set down, the titles removed, the relationship paused, what's actually left? Most people, when they sit with that question honestly, discover something unsettling. They don't know. Not because they're empty, but because the layers are so dense, so long established, so deeply habitual, that finding the signal underneath them requires a kind of excavation that most people have never attempted. Their career identity, the relational identity, the social identity, the ideological identity, the aesthetic identity, the carefully curated sense of taste and sensibility that signals membership in a particular tribe, layer on top of layer, assembled over decades, each one feeling at the time like the discovery of the self rather than the addition of another construction over it. And underneath all of it, something quieter, less impressive, less socially legible, but more genuinely yours than anything sitting on top of it. This video is about how to find that, not by destroying the layers, not by some dramatic act of self-reinvention, but by developing enough clarity about which layers are genuinely yours and which were assembled in response to external demands that you can begin to operate from a more honest foundation. That's the identity layer work. And it may be the most important work in this entire series. So let's look at what identity actually is. Before we can work with identity intelligently, we need to be precise about what it actually is. Because the common understanding of identity is almost exactly backward. The common understanding treats identity as a fixed, stable, essential thing, something you have, something that is either authentic or inauthentic, discovered or lost, known or unknown. The self as a noun, solid, definable, waiting to be found. That understanding is not supported by evidence, philosophical, psychological, or neuroscientific. Here's the more accurate version. Identity is a process, a dynamic, ongoing construction, a verb, not a noun. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio described the self as a continuous narrative the brain generates, moment to moment, drawing on memory, current sensation, social context, and anticipated future to create the experience of being a continuous, unified subject. That narrative is not discovered. It is made continuously in response to internal and external conditions. The philosopher David Parfit spent decades making a related argument in analytical philosophy. Personal identity over time is not a deep fact about the world. It is a useful fiction, a convention, a story that's worked well enough for practical purposes, but that under examination reveals itself as a constructed rather than given. Buddhism has been making this argument for 2,500 years. The doctrine of anatta, non-self, holds that what we experience as a fixed, persistent self is actually a collection of aggregates, form, sensation, perception, mental formation, consciousness, arising and passing in dependence on conditions. There is no unchanging essence underneath the aggregate. The self is the arising, not something separate from it. These are not obscure or marginal positions. They represent the convergence of philosophy, neuroscience, and the contemplative tradition on a single insight. The self is constructed, which means, and this is the part that should be both unsettling and liberating, you are not discovering who you are. You are at every moment in the process of constructing who you are from available materials with more or less awareness, with more or less intentionality. The identity layer work is about bringing awareness and intentionality to that construction process, examining the materials, asking where they came from, deciding which one belongs in the structure you're building now. That's the work. Let's look at how layers work. Understanding how layers form is essential to working with them intelligently, because the formation process explains why so much of what feels most essentially like you is actually inherited, adapted, or performed. Layers form through four primary mechanisms. Mechanism 1, environmental adaptation. The first and most fundamental mechanism. From the earliest period of life, the self is being shaped by the environment it's developing in, not passively, actively. The child is a meaning-making organism reading the available environment and adapting its emergent sense of self in response. What is welcome here and what is not? What version of me gets connection and what version of me gets withdrawal? What do I have to be safe, loved, accepted? These questions are not asked consciously. They are answered behaviorally. The child learns through thousands of small interactions over years which aspects of their actual nature are acceptable in the available environment and which are not. The aspects that are not acceptable don't disappear. They go underground. They become the unacknowledged interior, the not shown, not expressed, not claimed part of the self that continue to exist below the surface of the constructed identity. As development continues, the social mirror becomes increasingly important in identity constructions. The psychologist Charles Cooley described this as the looking glass self. The idea that we develop our senses of who we are primarily through our perception of how others see us. We look into the social mirror, read the reflection, and incorporate it into the self concept. The problem is that the social mirror is not neutral. It is shaped by the specific people doing the reflecting, their own limitations, projections, fears, and unexamined needs. The teacher who reflects back that you're not a mad person. The person who reflects back that you're the difficult one. The peer group that reflects back that this part of you is acceptable and that part is not. These reflections received at formative ages become layers, not because they're true, But because the developing self doesn't yet have the internal resources to evaluate them against anything more reliable than the social environment. You are in part a composite of other people's projections onto you. Not entirely, but significantly more than most people realize. Mechanism 3, the narrative consolidation. Over time, the layers consolidate into a narrative. A story of who you are, how you got here, what you like, what you are capable of, what you can expect from the world. The narrative is not a neutral record. It is a selective construction emphasizing certain experiences, minimizing others, creating coherence and continuity from what is actually a much more fragmentary and contradictory reality. The narrative self is useful. It provides continuity, predictability, a working model of who you are that you can operate from in daily life without having to reconstruct yourself from scratch every morning. But the narrative consolidates things that shouldn't be consolidated. It makes permanent what should be provisional. It hardens possibilities into certainties. I am not creative. That's a narrative consolidation. I'm not good in relationship. Narrative consolidation. I'm someone who doesn't finish things. Narrative consolidation. Each one of those was, at some point, an experience or a reflection. It became a layer when it was incorporated into the narrative as a defining feature rather than a situational response. Mechanism 4, deliberate constructions. Some layers are chosen more consciously. The professional identity deliberately cultivated, the ideological commitments deliberately adopted, the aesthetic identity deliberately assembled. These feel more genuinely ours because we choose them. But chosen layers can be also external in origin, assembled from available cultural materials, adopted in response to social belonging needs, constructed to signal something to a particular audience rather than to accurately express something internal. The question to bring to deliberate construction is not just did I choose this, but what was I trying to achieve by choosing it? And does it still serve that purpose genuinely? Some deliberate construction are genuinely yours. Some are performed authenticity, chosen to appear a certain way, maintained because changing them would require admitting they weren't genuine in the first place. The distinction matters for the work. At number 4, let's look at the 5 layers. The identity layer model I work with has 5 layers. They move from outermost to innermost, from socially constructed to genuinely yours. This is not a rigid taxonomy. It's a working map. Use it as a tool for examination, not as a fixed system to be adopted wholesale. Layer 1, the performed self. The outermost layer, the version of yourself you present in social and professional contexts, conscious, managed, calibrated for audience. The outermost layer, the version of yourself you present in social and professional contexts, conscious, managed, calibrated for audience. This layer is not inherently inauthentic. Social performance is a part of human life. Adjusting your register, your tone, your level of disclosure to the context is not dishonesty, it is basic social intelligence. The layer becomes a problem when it's the only version of yourself you can access. When the performance has been running so long and so continuously that the performer has lost reliable contact with whatever is underneath it. The signal that you're operating primarily from layer one, exhaustion after most social interaction, regardless of whether they were pleasant. The performance is costly. If even enjoyable interactions reliably leave you depleted, the performance is doing the depletion, not the interaction itself. Layer two, the relational self. The second layer is identity constituted by your relationships and the role within them. The partner, the parent, the child, the friend, the colleague, the mentor. Each relational role shapes a version of the self, a way of being, a set of behaviors, a presentation of particular aspects while other aspects recede. Relational identity is real. The self is genuinely shaped by relationship. The void phase, when significant relationships are removed, is disorienting, partly because an entire layer of identity goes with them. The layer becomes a problem when the relational roles have become more real to you than whatever exists outside of them. When you don't know who you are, when you're not being someone's partner, parent, child, or colleague, when the roles are the only answer available to the question, who am I? The relational self is a layer, not a foundation, built on something, not itself the ground. Layer three, the achieved self. The third layer is identity constituted by whatever you've done, built, and accomplished. The career, the credential, the reputation, the demonstrated competences. This layer feels particularly solid because it has external evidence. Things you made, things you did, things other people can point to and confirm. But achievement is a layer, not a self. The person who has built a career on a particular identity, the expert, the founder, the successful professional, and who then loses that career, discovers how much of their sense of self was sitting in layer three. Not because the achievements weren't real, because they were being used as the primary evidence of self's value and existence. Achievement identity is particularly resistant to examination because it comes with social validation that makes it feel like truth rather than construction. People say, I am this, I've done these things, this must be who I am. But what you've achieved is what you've done, it is not what you are. The layer keeps the distinction invisible. Layer four, the ideological self, or the ideological self. The fourth layer is the identity constituted by your beliefs, values, worldviews, and commitments. Political identity, religious or spiritual identity, philosophical commitments, the frameworks through which you interpret reality and make meaning. This layer feels most essentially like the self because it operates at the level of meaning. These are things you do believe. Surely that's closer to the core. Sometimes it is, but ideology forms in response to belonging needs, to the requirements of a particular community, to the reaction against an environment that held a different ideology, to the need for a framework that makes experience coherent. The ideological self can be genuinely yours, arrived at through honest inquiry, held with appropriate humility, revised as evidence and understanding developed. It can also be a layer, adopted for belonging, maintained for identity coherence, defended not because the ideas have been examined, but because questioning them would destabilize the sense of self organized around them. The signal that ideology has become a layer rather than a genuine position, the inability to hold the ideas with uncertainty, the experience of ideas as threats to be defended rather than propositions to be examined. Layer 5, the conditional self. The deepest layer before what's genuinely underneath. The conditioned self is the composite of all the environmental adaptation, social reflection, and narrative consolidates from early development, the belief about what is safe to be, the rules about what can be expressed and what must be suppressed, the core operating assumption about self and world that were formed earliest and run most automatically. This layer is the hardest to see because it predates the capacity for self-observation. It was formed before you had the conceptual framework to recognize it as a construction rather than as a reality itself. It contained the deepest wounds and the most fundamental misbeliefs, the ones that feels like beliefs and must like facts. The world is not safe. I am fundamentally not enough. Closeness leads to loss. Visibility leads to punishment. These aren't beliefs at layer 5. They feel like bedrock, like the given condition of existence. The layer 5 work is the most significant and the work that most benefits from professional support, because what's operating at layer 5 is running everything above it. The patterns tracked in video 5, the relational reflection mapped in video 7, the energy economy documented in video 8, they are all in significant part being generated by layer 5 operating structures. You cannot fully address the upper layers without eventually being willing to look at what's operating at the base. Act number 5, how to identify which layers are yours. The central question of the identity layers work is not who am I, but something more specific and more workable. Which part of this constructed identity are genuinely mine, and which were assembled in response to something other than my own actual nature? That question requires a specific set of inquiries. Here they are. Inquiry 1, the origin inquiry. For each of the significant aspects of your current identity, a belief, a value, a role, a commitment, characteristic you claim as essentially you, ask, where did this come from? Not in a blaming way, in a genuinely curious, investigative way. What is the actual origin of this aspect of how I see myself? Was it chosen from honest inquiry, received from an environment that required it, adopted to belong to a particular group, formed as a reaction against something else, inherited without examination? The origin doesn't determine the value. Something inherited can be genuinely yours. Something chosen can be performed rather than real. But knowing the origin gives you information that staying inside the layer doesn't. Inquiry 2, the aliveness inquiry. This is the most immediate and least intellectual inquiry, and often the most revealing. For each significant aspect of your current identity, ask, does this make me feel more alive or less alive? Not more secure, not more socially acceptable, not more secure, not more socially acceptable, not more impressive or more safe, more alive. There is a specific felt quality to operating something genuinely yours, a quality of recognition, of energy, of presence, not always comfortable, genuinely yours. Things are sometimes uncomfortable, but genuinely yours things are sometimes uncomfortable, but alive in a way that the performed version are not. Conversely, the performed layers have a specific flatness, a going through the motions quality, a sense of operating at a slight but persistent remove from your own experience. The aliveness inquiry cuts through the narrative and the justification directly to the felt experience. That experience is data. Inquiry number 3, the subtraction inquiry. Ask, if I remove this aspect of my identity, this role, this belief, this commitment, this characteristic, what would be left? Not as an intention to remove it, as an inquiry into how dependent your sense of self is on it. The aspects of your identity that are most genuinely yours tend to survive the subtraction inquiry with relative stability. You can imagine removing the career, the role, the ideology, and something underneath remains recognizable, not unchanged, but present. The layers that are most externally constructed tend to produce a specific kind of vertigo in the subtraction inquiry. The sense that removing this would leave nothing, that the layer is not sitting on top of a self, but is performing the function the self is supposed to perform. That vertigo is information, not evidence that the layer must be maintained, evidence that the work underneath it is unfinished. Inquiry number 4, the permission inquiry. Ask, am I claiming this aspect of my identity with my own permission, or am I waiting for external permission that will never fully arrive? Some people have spent decades waiting for permission to be who they actually are. Permission from a parent who will never give it, from a culture that doesn't recognize it, from a version of themselves constructed long ago that hasn't been updated. The permission inquiry asks whether the identity you're living is one you have been authorized from inside, or one you're still waiting to be told you're allowed to have. And identity doesn't require external authorization. It doesn't need to be legible to everyone, approved by the relevant authorities, or recognized by the people whose recognition you've been seeking. It needs to be yours. The permission inquiry locates the places where that authorization hasn't happened yet, where you're still performing a layer while waiting for something from outside to release you into something most real. That release doesn't come from outside. It never did. Act number 6, the stripping process. The stripping process is not a one-time event. It is an ongoing practice of gradually reducing investment in the constructed layers and gradually increasing contact with what is underneath them. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because the word stripping can imply something dramatic and total. something you do all at once, a radical act of self reinvention. That's not what this is. The stripping process is slow. It happens incrementally, mostly in small moments of honesty that don't announce themselves as significant, and that only look significant in retrospect when enough of them have accumulated to produce a visible shift. Here's what it actually looks like in practice. Daily life, it looks like the honest speech practice from video 4. The small, repeated act of saying the true thing instead of perform thing. Each instance of that is a small reduction in the investment in layer 1. Over time, the aggregate of those small reductions changes the relationship between the performed self and whatever is underneath it. In relationships, it looks like allowing a significant relationship to encounter the actual version of you that rather than the role. One honest disclosure at a time. One moment of genuine contact rather than managed interaction. The relational layer doesn't strip all at once. It thins gradually as the relationship is asked to hold more of the actual person than the role. In professional life, it looks like bringing your genuine perspective into a professional context where you've been performing agreement or competence. Small acts of intellectual honesty. Small moments of genuine rather than performed contribution. Layer 3, things when achievement stop being used as a substitute for presence. In your belief systems, it looked like holding your commitment with slightly more uncertainty than before. Allowing a previously held position to be questioned. Being willing to not know something you previously claimed to know. Layer 4, things when ideology stops being used as a defense against the discomfort of genuine inquiry. In the deepest work, it looks like the layer work practice from video 3 combined with whatever professional support you have access to. The slow, careful excavation of layer 5 material. The conditional operation structure with enough support that the excavation doesn't destabilize the entire system. The stripping process has no completion point. It is not a destination. It is a direction toward more contact with what's genuinely underneath, less maintenance of what's constructed on top of it. That direction, pursued consistently and honestly over time, produces a specific kind of change in how you inhabit your life. Not more impressive, more present. Not more legible to outside, more recognized to yourself. Act number 7, what's underneath. This is the part of the video I've been approaching all along, and the part I want to be most careful about. Because there's a version of this conversation that make what's underneath the layers sound like a treasure, a perfect, pristine, unconditioned, essential self waiting to be discovered, pure and unspoiled beneath the accumulated construction. That's romantic, and it isn't accurate. What's under the treasure, what's under the layer, is not a treasure. It's not a wound either. It's something more honest than both of those. It's a particular quality of being, less organized around the opinions and the expectation of others, less defended, less performed, less managed, more responsive to actual present reality rather than past conditioning, more available to genuine contact with other people, with work, with experience. Not perform, not enlightened, not invulnerable. Actually, more vulnerable in some ways because the layers serve a real protective function and their absence is genuinely more exposed. But more real in a way that one's experience makes the constructed versions feel hollow in comparison. Different traditions describe what's underneath in different ways. Different traditions describes what's underneath in different ways. The Vedantic tradition call it Atman, the unchanging awareness that witnesses the content of experience without being identified to it. Not the thoughts, not the emotions, not the sensations, the awareness in which all of those arise and pass. Jungian psychology call it self with a capital S, distinguished from the ego, the persona, the shadow, the self as the organizing center of the psyche, larger than the ego, oriented towards wholeness rather than coherence. Buddhist philosophy is careful not to name it as a thing, because naming it risks creating another layer, another identity to attach to it. Instead, it points towards it through practice, the quality of awareness that remains when all objects of awareness have passed. I'm not going to tell you which of those framing is correct. I'm not sure the question of correctness applies here in the same way as it applies elsewhere. What I can tell you is what the practitioners of every serious contemplative tradition and what the psychologists working with deep identity transformation consistently point towards. When the layer thins out, when the performance quiets, the roles rest, the narrative loosens its grip. There is something there, quiet, stable, less interested in being impressive than being present. That something is not separate from you. It's not hidden from you by the layers. It's more like it's been speaking continuously in a register, too quiet to hear over the noise of the construction. The identity layer work doesn't create it. It just gets quiet enough to hear it. And once you've heard it, even once, even briefly, you know what you're working towards. Not a better construction version of the self. The thing underneath all of the construction, which was never missing, only obscured. Act number 8, the practice. The identity layer practice has 3 components. They work at different time scales and different depth. Component 1, the daily layer check. The daily layer check. Once per day, morning works well before the day's performance requires are fully activated. 30 seconds, one question asked honestly, without pressure to produce an answer. Which layer am I operating from right now? Not a full analysis, a simple orientation check. Am I in the performance layer, managing how I appear? Am I in a relational role, being someone's something? Am I in achievement mode, using what I've done as evidence of what I am? Or is there something quieter present underneath? Some quality of being that isn't organized around any of that. You don't have to be in a quiet place to ask the question. The question itself maintains the awareness that the quiet place exists. That's its value. 30 seconds, one question daily. Component 2, the monthly layer inventory. Once per month, 30 to 45 minutes. Work through 4 questions in writing. Question 1. Which layer was most dominant this month? And what construction was I most identified with, most defended, most dependent on? Question 2. Were there moments this month when the identity layer thinned, when something more genuine came through? What were the conditions that allowed that? Question 3. What am I currently using the dominant layer to protect myself from feeling or facing? Question 4. What would it look like to bring slightly more of the genuine interior into one specific context next month? Not everything, one context, one relationship, one professional situation, one recurrent interaction where slightly more honesty would be available. Small, specific, one context at a time. The monthly inventory doesn't produce dramatic revelation. It produces incremental quality, a gradual, more precise map of which layers are operating, what they're protecting, and where the next small movement towards genuine is available. Component 3, the annual review. Once per year. And this one benefits from a longer dedicated block, ideally a day or at least half a day. Work through the 5 layers systematically. For each layer, ask 3 questions. What does this layer currently look like in my life? Is this layer more or less prominent than it was a year ago? Is the context of this layer more or less genuinely mine than it was a year ago? The annual review creates the longitudinal perspective that the daily and monthly practice can't provide. You're looking at the direction of travel over a significant period. Is the overall movement towards more genuinely inhabitation of your life or toward more constructed distance from it? That question, asked honestly once a year, keeps the work oriented correctly. Not towards self-improvement, towards self-honesty. Not towards a better performance, towards the thing underneath the performance that has been there all along. Act number 9, let's bring this to a close. I want to close this video and this deep dive series with something that took me a long time to understand, and that I think is the most important thing I can say about this work. The layers are not the enemy. This entire series has, in some cases, been about seeing the construction clearly enough to work with them honestly. The patterns, the performances, the conditional response, the inherited belief, the accumulated weight of what we built in response to conditions rather than from genuine interior. And it can start to feel, if you're doing this work seriously, like the goal is the dismantling, the stripping away, the relentless moving of everything constructed until only the genuine remain. That's not the goal. The layers serve functions. They provide continuity, social belonging, navigable identity, protection from genuine exposure before genuine safety exists. The performance self, the relational self, the achieved self, these are how human beings survive development and build lives in social reality. The goal is not to destroy the layers, it is to stop being unconsciously governed by them. To know which layer you're in and why, to be able to move between layers with awareness rather than being locked into one without realizing it. To have access to what's underneath, not as a permanent state of pure authenticity, which isn't a realistic or even desirable goal, but as a reference point, as place to return to when the construction has drifted too far from the signal. The Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki said something that I think gets this better than most anything else I've encountered. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert mind, there are a few. He was talking about practice, but I think it applies to identity. The constructed self is the expert mind, organized, coherent, defended, certain about what it is and what it isn't, efficient, navigable, and closed in specific and significant ways to the actual possibilities of each present moment. The thing underneath the layers, the quieter, less organized, less defended awareness is the beginner's mind, less impressive, more open, less certain, more present. The work is not to become permanently the beginner. It is to keep the beginner's mind available underneath the expert as a resource, as a return. So that when the expert mind has run its course, when the layers have done their work and the moment calls for something more genuine, you know how to find your way back to the thing that was always there, quieter than everything built on top of it, and more essentially, yours than any of it. This completes the deep dive series. The final video 10, the Honest Inventor Deep Dive, takes everything from this series and give you the complete integration practice, the one practice that holds all the others. The link is above. Take care of yourself.